Hello everyone, my name is Haley Testa, and this is the presentation for my History of Psychology project. For this presentation, I will be discussing Heraclitus and Parmenides. Both Heraclitus and Parmenides are two of the most well-known pre-Socratic philosophers. Both of these brilliant philosophers could be considered metaphysicians, meaning that they wanted to define what change in the universe truly was, by basing it on an abstract but fundamental concept. This fundamental concept is where we find their obvious disagreement, though. To start, Heraclitus is a Greek philosopher from the 6th century BCE. His ideas were criticisms of other well-known philosophers such as Homer, Pythagoras, and Xenophanes, although he never outright named names or directly wrote about these contradictory ideologies. Before we dig deep into the philosophical ideas of Heraclitus, let's get some background information. Let's look at some insight of his upbringing. Heraclitus lived in Ephesus, an important city in the Ionian coast of Asia, not far from Miletus, the birthplace of philosophy. We know nothing of his life other than what can be said from his own statements and philosophical ideas. Although Plato thought he wrote after Parmenides, it is more likely that he wrote before Parmenides, for he criticizes by name important thinkers and writers with whom he disagrees. For example, Pythagoras, but he does not mention Parmenides. Heraclitus seemed to reflect an aristocratic calling for the masses and sought to influence the rule of a few wise men. For instance, when he recommends that his fellow citizens hang themselves because they have banished their most important leader. From what he learned in his experience in Ephesus, he came to the conclusion that he thought all human beings lacked understanding, to which inspired his philosophical ideas an attempt to understand understanding and showcase what he believed to those around him. Heraclitus's most famous theory was that he believed that everything in nature was in a state of flux. Flux is another word for change. He emphasized that the only thing that is constant in life is change. From his idea of the flux of nature, he recognizes a law-like flux of elements. Of this law-like assumption is what was more accurate in terms of what Plato and Aristotle interpreted from his idea. Where did he get this idea of change, though? His idea of change came from what he witnessed from fire. Fire was the nature of his theories on change. He found that everything that fire touches changes. For example, a bundle of logs in a fire pit changes into a pile of ash, or a hunk of raw steak changes into a cooked, more appetizing piece of steak. Even further, he had the idea that nothing ever is, but everything is becoming. In more understandable terms, he meant that nothing is neither hot nor cold, but becoming hotter or colder. For example, a fresh cup of coffee is not just hot, but becoming colder as it cools off, or it's becoming hotter as it's heated up. Heraclitus's idea of becoming, rather than being, influenced ideas of the philosopher Hegel of the 19th century. Hegel's lectures are described as a tribute to his spiritual predecessor, to whom the foundations of his own philosophy, or Hegel's own philosophy, can be traced back to. He applauded Heraclitus in his attempt to define the absolute, to which Hegel found an attractive theory, however, one that Plato struggled to understand, according to Hegel's lectures. As well as Hegel, Nietzsche applauded Aristotle as well, but remained in a more rationalist light. As we see in this quote, Each word of Heraclitus expresses the pride and the majesty of truth, but of truth grasped in intuitions rather than attained by a rope ladder of logic. Nietzsche's view of Heraclitus is an anti-dualistic, anti-metaphysician perspective that claimed that there is only one world, a world of becoming, that is entirely physical and reachable to those who are not swayed by conceptual interruptions such as sensory experience. Nietzsche, contrary to Hegel, thought that the idea of becoming rather than being must only be true once proven through logic. In Nietzsche's regard, he actually claimed that supporting theory would need to be done through observing the natural and/or physical world in order to prove this to be real. A famous quote that came from Heraclitus reads, "It is impossible to step into the same river twice." What did he mean by this? In short, he meant that the river will never be the same as it was when it was first stepped into. And if we actually think about it, when we step into a river, the water that touches your foot rushes down the river, completely passing your foot and never touching it again. In an actual quote from Heraclitus, he said, "On those stepping into rivers, staying the same other, and other waters flow." This is one of the most important Heraclitus interpretations we can take away from his theories in this presentation, as well as his ideas that have been mentioned thus far. He believed that everything existed between polar opposites, that everything was neither here nor there, but in a state of in-between, or becoming and not being, which can be understood if we think about sickness and health. We cannot know sickness until we know health, and we cannot know health until we know sickness. Thus, we cannot simply be healthy or sick, but in between these opposites on a fluid scale. We are becoming healthy or becoming sick, emphasizing that our knowledge of the two comes from the flux of one or the other. Many of his theories and main focuses came from the sensory experience, believing that certainty and knowledge was something that was in fact detectable from the senses, but science was discovered and used in order to answer questions derived from sensory experience, proving his ideas to a rationalist crowd through proving it through science. However, Heraclitus claimed that science was used to make certainty seem flawless, when in reality the science of knowing is only probabilistic and needs more theorizing. To bring Heraclitus into more historical terms, Heraclitus is a known empiricist, this meaning that his ideas of knowledge and reality were developed as a result of sensory experience. Empiricists are also known for having the same ideal he had about being versus becoming. As Heraclitus said, everything is becoming, nothing is simply being. It is also known that empiricists believed, the same as Heraclitus, that everything in the universe and within humanity and nature is constantly in a state of flux or is constantly changing. William James, for example, is a famously known empirical psychologist. Empirical psychology is a psychological theory proven by sensory experience, and William James was the psychologist that found that there is a connection between body and mind, meaning our sensory experience impacts our emotional experience. Before we continue, let's review Heraclitus' main themes. Change was a main factor in most of his theories, and he believed that the only thing constant in life is change. He also had the theories about being versus becoming. He believed that nothing is simply in a state of being, but becoming. Thus, with this becoming idea, it led to his ideas that everything is in between two polar opposites. He relied and supported the sensory experience and is a valid example of empiricism, of which influenced empirical psychology, such as the psychologist William James and his theories of body and mind. Now, let's move on to Parmenides. Parmenides was most active in 5th century BCE and is known for his direct criticism of Heraclitus' ideologies. Parmenides' writings and ideas are said to be a great contributor to the later, even more famous ideas of Plato and Plato's student, Aristotle. As we did with Heraclitus, let's get some background information on Parmenides as well. In Plato's dialogue, titled Parmenides, there is a fictionalized visit to Athens by the eminent Parmenides and his younger associate Zeno to attend the festival of the great Pananthea. Plato describes Parmenides as about 65 years old, and Socrates, with whom he converses with in the first part of the dialogue, as quite young, which is normally taken to mean about 20 for this time period. Given that Socrates was a little past 70 when executed by the Athenians in 399 BCE, one can infer from this description that Parmenides was born about 515 BCE, which would prove his activity during the 5th century BCE. Parmenides composed only a single work. This was a metaphysical and cosmological poem in the traditional epic medium of hexameter verse titled On Nature. His poem was written to describe his journey to meet a goddess, however it is unclear whether this is fiction or an authentic tale. In this poem, the goddess is actually the one who comes to the Enlightenment conclusion that Parmenides must learn all things. To this revelation is responsible to how he came to be in his philosophical ideas and his later teachings to Plato and Aristotle. To begin on his theories, Parmenides believed that all change is an illusion. He believed there is only one reality, one that is finite, uniform, and motionless. He claimed that reality could only be understood through logic and reasoning. In more specific words of his doctrine, his view on change is described as that change is either a case of coming to be from what is not, or perishing into what is not. So, change is just a bound up within the forbidden root of trying to think or speak of what is not. In other words, change is a fundamentally incoherent concept of reality and of man, and in terms of what Heraclitus said, in terms of nature as well. Although Aristotle, in some trickle-down effect, can be considered a student of Parmenides, Aristotle interpreted his view that change is an illusion as his claiming that reality is permanent, to which Aristotle believed to be an unfulfilled idea. Aristotle wanted to find an explanation to this, of which Aristotle attempted to define the behavior of reality rather than what it was. And he explained that all of nature serves to reach an end, which this idea is very different from what Parmenides attempted to say. In direct opposite of Heraclitus, Parmenides believed that everything is in a state of being instead of becoming. Heraclitus held that the multiplicity of existing things, their changing forms and motion, are but an appearance of a single eternal reality, or the state of being. Thus, giving rise to the Parmenidean principle that all is one. From this concept of being, he went on to say that all claims of change or of non-being are illogical and just a weakness of reality or the sensory experience. To further the sensory experience idea, he claimed that sensory experience created only illusions, and that those who rely on sensory experience for knowledge and reality were lacking clear logic and understanding of what knowledge and reality actually was. He believed that reality is known from questioning and reasoning, or scientific proven fact of research and studies. From his ideas of reality, he claimed that being able to think or speak of something proved the existence of something, meaning, we cannot speak of or think of something that simply does not exist. Therefore, the sensory experience did not support the thinking or speaking of something's existence, but knowledge of something leading us to be able to think or speak of it did in fact prove its existence. Parmenides was the designer of Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox attempted to use logical arguments to prove that motion is just an illusion. The Zeno paradox said that, for an object to go from point A to point B, it must first go half the distance between point A and point B. Then it must go half the remaining distance, then half of that distance, and so on. Because there is an infinite amount of points between any 2 points, the process can never stop. Also, the object must pass through an infinite number of points in a finite amount of time, and according to Zeno's paradox, this is completely impossible. Therefore, it is logically impossible for object A to ever reach point B. The fact that it seems to do so is a weakness of the senses and a weakness of reality. All of Parmenides' ideas and information he claimed to only be correct because backed up by logic, mathematics, and reason. Overall, he claimed that all information or ideas could only be correct if they were backed up by logic or reason. This claim includes the context of information from both logistic theories and sensory theories, but either could only be a correct assumption if accurate correlation to logic was used to state the claim. As we brought Heraclitus into more historical light, let's do the same for Parmenides. Parmenides can be known as a rationalist. Rationalists, much like Parmenides, believe that there is only permanence in the universe and within humanity, meaning that nothing is changing. It is also clear that Parmenides was a rationalist with his views that logic, mathematics, and reason were the only way to prove validity and correctness, as well as his idea that misconceptions, or more specifically illusions, were a direct result from attempting to rely on sensory experience. We see again that he used rationalistic ideas and theories. In the history of psychology, Albert Ellis is known as the father of rational treatment. His rational treatment is described as gaining the honesty necessary to conduct self-analysis. He thought that his technique of rational emotive behavioral therapy can teach any intelligent person how to stop feeling miserable about practically anything. In using practical strategies of therapy and self-analysis, it is proven that anyone can stop their own self-defeating emotions and behaviors. We can see that this is similar enough to Parmenides, because both Parmenides' and Albert Ellis' opinions come from using practical, logical paths and reasoning. As we did with Heraclitus, let's summarize the main themes of Parmenides as well. In contrary to Heraclitus, Parmenides believed that all change is an illusion, and he believed that the sensory experience is what created this illusion. But he believed that if something can be spoken of or thought of, then it is proven to be real and exist. He also conducted the Zeno's paradox, which proved that motion is an illusion, and he also concluded all of his theories by thinking that nothing can be proven without logic, fact, reasoning, or questioning. The two philosophers, Heraclitus and Parmenides, are the yin and yang of philosophical history. It is clear to see that these two are pretty blatant opposites in their ideologies. Heraclitus claimed everything is constantly changing, while Parmenides claimed that change is just an illusion. But what does opposites represent in a yin and yang without a sense of similarity as well? Although these two famous philosophers have the most contradictory ideas to each other, it can be said that they agreed on two valuable, fundamental ideas that contributed to their blatantly different perspectives. Heraclitus and Parmenides both had a significant attachment to knowledge. Knowledge was their strictest sense of perspective. Their values of knowing nourished how they viewed reality, nature, and change. Although they each had their own different opinions of what each of these concepts were, based on their personal findings and theories, knowledge was always a universal factor in their ideologies. And knowledge contributed to both of their philosophical perspectives and ideas. Along with knowledge, both of these pre-Socratic philosophers have a fundamental base of reality as well. They both had the parallel ideal that in order for something to exist, it must be real, even though they had different perspectives of what was real and how to prove that. Specifically, Parmenides believed that reality is eternal, and Heraclitus believed that reality is everlasting. Both of these words are synonyms, so really two had one shared perspective of their theorizing. And of course, they each had their own opinions of whether sensory experience nourished or defected reality. Heraclitus believed that senses could prove reality from science, and Parmenides believed that senses were unreliable and created illusion. When we bring these two fundamental concepts together, we find an interconnectedness of the two. It is almost similar to what Heraclitus thought of polar opposites. For these two philosophers, there could not be a reality without knowledge, and vice versa, there could not be knowledge without reality. But this interconnectedness that reality and knowledge have with Heraclitus and Parmenides gives validity to both of their theories. They remain credible in their perspectives, and again, these two fundamental concepts created the contrasting views that we see throughout this presentation. Although we see obvious contradictions between Heraclitus and Parmenides, Plato tried to resolve the gap between their two worlds. Heraclitus believed that there is only one real world of the forms, which was perfect and unchanging, and there is the sensible world that we all perceive around us, which is just an imperfect copy of the world of forms. Thus, this imperfection makes it an illusion. Included in these illusions are the appearances of change, as well as familiar illusions such as visible space shrinking with distance in all three dimensions. Plato attempted to use both Heraclitus and Parmenides' ideas in ideas of math and physics. Both of these philosophers' ideas and theories relate to modern times. This relates to modern times, because we still have two worlds: the sensible world we perceive around us, and the world of theoretical science, of which physicists describe as the world of underlying causes of phenomena and illusion. Thus, to both Heraclitus's and Parmenidas's view, they are both valid in their perspectives, even in today's modern times perspectives of the world.